Hello, all, and welcome to This Is Where I Land. Um, where do I start? This past week has been a doozy for me. My daughter and I have been suffering with a cold, and we've both been battling losing our voices and trying to get them back. So today might be a little bit rough. I hope you all will bear with me. I might have to stop and take a little drink of my Sprite here. Hopefully, I can try to project as much as I can so that you can hear me. Um, it probably doesn't help that today's um, episode is going to also be a little bit emotional for me. Um, the uh, the past week, we started a new segment on grief, and today that continues this week, and we're going to be talking about the loss of someone special, um, or any loss in your life, as far as a person. So we will go ahead and get started again. Please bear with me. I'll do the best that I can. And I may have to take a little break now and again. Maybe not just because of my voice, maybe because of emotions. But hopefully we can get through this together. All right. So, anyways, this Thursday, August 13th, will be 10 years since my dad died. 10 years. That's such a strange thing to say out loud because 10 years sounds like a long time. Long enough that you would think grief would have settled neatly into some corner of your life, that you'd understand it by now, that maybe enough time would eventually separate who you are today from the person who stood there 10 years ago and watched someone she loved die. But grief doesn't really work that way. There was a time when I couldn't even say that my dad had died. I could say that I lost him, and I could say that he had passed away, but died, that word felt different. It felt final, too permanent. Almost like saying it out loud meant I had to accept something my mind still couldn't understand. Sometimes I wonder if that's what trauma does. The world keeps moving, but some part of you stays behind. Frozen in a moment your mind wasn't ready to process. And maybe that's why certain memories become so vivid. They don't feel 10 years old. Sometimes they feel just like yesterday. There are things about losing my dad that I understand differently now than I did then. And there are things I don't think I really allowed myself to understand at all. Because when my dad died, I didn't go talk to anyone. I didn't sit down with a grief counselor. I didn't really know how to process what had just happened. I just kept going. And for a long time, I think I confused continuing to function with actual grieving. Looking back now, I can see that there was so much I was carrying. Losing my dad was part of it, but there was something else tangled up in that loss: guilt. There were things between my dad and me that I never made right. And 10 years later, I think I'm finally able to talk about what that did to my grief. Before I tell you about losing my dad, I want to tell you about my dad. I don't want this entire story to be about cancer or death or the things I wish I'd done differently because my dad had a whole life before he became someone I was grieving. When I was little, he used to read If You Give a Mouse a Cookie to me. And he didn't just read it, my God, he performed it. He made all the sounds the mouse would make as if the mouse was eating his cookie or trampling across the floor, even pouring the milk, all of it. Oh, the fun my sister and I had on my parents' waterbed, reenacting every scene of that book. And all these years later, sometimes I can still hear his voice. That's one of the strangest things about losing someone. You start realizing how much of them lives on inside the things nobody else would think were important. A children's book, a sound, a phrase, the way they laughed, the way they said your name or your nickname. Mine was Deet, by the way. And I have this fear sometimes that one day I won't remember what his voice sounded like because photographs can preserve someone's face, but memory has to carry the rest. But grief doesn't only preserve the memories we want to keep. Sometimes it holds onto the moments we wish we could change to. Before my dad got sick, we had had an argument. At the time, I didn't like the woman he was with. And I had spent a long time feeling like he was choosing that relationship over his children. And I won't lie, I was hurt. Eventually, that hurt came out as anger. I finally stood up for how I felt, but I said some things to my dad that I'm not proud of. The complicated part is that I don't regret telling him I was hurt. I regret the way I chose to express it. But at that time, I couldn't separate those two things. I was angry, I was stubborn, and I felt like apologizing would somehow mean that taking it would be like taking back everything I had finally found the courage to say. So I didn't. I moved into my new home. And about a month later, my dad called me. Previously, before I moved into my new home, I had stayed with him for a little while and he had let us know that he had cancer, but it was fully treatable. At this point in time, I was almost exactly a month into after I bought my first home. He called and he told me his cancer was terminal. Suddenly, everything else became very small. The months that followed were a whirlwind. I did everything I knew how I could do it to be there for him and help take care of him. But somehow I never went back and finished that conversation. There's another part of grief that I don't think we talk about enough. what happens when someone dies and there are still things left unsaid. For years, I carried this belief that I should have apologized to my dad, not because my feelings weren't valid anymore. And I had finally reached a point where I was willing to say so. What I regret isn't that I stood up for myself. I regret some of the ways I chose to do it. And that's and in that there's a difference. I think it took me years to understand that because guilt has a way of rewriting the entire story. It can convince you that because you regret one moment, you have to condemn the person you were in that moment. But I don't think accountability has to look like that anymore. I can look back and say, I wish I had handled that differently. I wish I had put my pride down. I wish I would have told my dad that I was sorry for the things that I'd said. All of these things can be true. And maybe that's one of the most painful parts of losing someone when something is still unresolved. There's no longer an opportunity to go back and finish the conversation. You can rehearse it 1,000 times in your head. You can imagine what you would have said, and you can imagine what they might have said back to you. But eventually, you have to learn how to live without the ending you'd wish you had given it. For me, that's what unresolved grief has sometimes felt like a door I never completely closed. And for years, some part of me kept looking back at it, wishing my dad were still standing there, just so I could say one more thing. 10 years later, I can't change that conversation with my dad. And I've had to learn how to live with that. But I can decide what I do with the lesson that it left behind. And one of the biggest things grief has taught me in this is don't let your pride make decisions that love may someday have to live with. That doesn't mean you have to make peace with everyone who has hurt you. It doesn't mean abandoning your boundaries. And it certainly doesn't mean apologizing just to keep someone in your life. Sometimes walking away is the right decision. But I think there's a question worth asking before we close a door. If this was the last conversation we ever had, would I be at peace with how I left it? Not would I take back how I feel? Not was I wrong for being hurt? But did I say what I needed to say in a way that I can live with? Because those are very different questions. I didn't understand that when my dad was alive. I thought apologizing meant surrendering my position. Like, I'm sorry somehow meant saying you were right and I was wrong. And it doesn't. Sometimes an apology simply means I still believe my feelings mattered. I just wish I hadn't used them to hurt you. And God, I wish I had understood that sooner. I can't give that apology to my dad anymore, like I said before. But I can let the apology I never gave him change the way I love people now. I can put my pride down sooner. I can say I'm sorry when I know I've caused hurt. I can tell people I love them while they're still here to hear it. And I can try not to leave behind words that may someday desperately make me wish I could have taken them back. Maybe that's one way we can make something meaningful out of regret. We can stop asking the past to change and allow it to change us instead. But there's something else I've had to learn. Accountability can teach us something, but eventually guilt can become its own kind of prison. There's a difference between saying, I wish I had done that differently, and spending the rest of your life believing you did deserve to suffer because you don't. For a long time, I don't think I knew the difference. Part of me felt like holding on to the guilt was somehow connected to loving my dad. Like letting myself off the hook meant I was saying what happened didn't matter because it did matter. And I can acknowledge that without sentencing myself to it forever. That's the complicated thing when the person you want to apologize to is gone. You don't get to control whether they would have forgiven you. You don't get to hear them say it's okay. You don't get the closure of knowing exactly what they would have said. And you don't get the closure of knowing exactly how everything would have come out, how they would have dealt with it, and how you would have changed as a person. All you know is who you are now and how to still deal with that person that's left. And I think I'm finally learning that forgiving myself doesn't erase what happened and it doesn't rewrite the past. Even though the words can't disappear, it just means I'm no longer requiring that person to keep paying a price for my inexperience of not knowing who I was 10 years ago, comparatively to what I understand now. I think the younger, hurt, angry version of myself has definitely made a lot of changes. And I didn't know that at the time. If I could go back, would I have handled things differently? Absolutely. And maybe accepting that is part of grief as well. Accepting that the story is finished, even when there are sentences you desperately wish you could rewrite. So maybe the work now isn't figuring out how to go back. Maybe it's learning how to carry the lesson forward without carrying the punishment with it. And after 10 years, I don't want guilt to be the loudest thing I remember about my dad because my dad was a wonderful father. Was he perfect? Of course not. None of us are. Maybe he could have been a little naive sometimes, but he loved me and he loved us. And there are so many pieces of him that I still carry with me. And now that I have children of my own, I think about all of this differently. I want my children to see that when we hurt someone, even when our own hurt is valid, we can go back. We can say, I shouldn't have said that. I could have handled that differently, and I'm sorry. And none of those words erase the reason we were upset in the first place. Taking accountability doesn't mean surrendering your feelings. It means taking responsibility for what you choose to do with them. That's the cycle I want to break. I don't want pride to keep me from repairing something that love would rather preserve. I don't want my children growing up believing that apologizing means losing an argument. And I especially don't want them to wait until tomorrow to say something that needs to be said today. Because sometimes tomorrow doesn't give us another conversation. That's something I learned in one of the hardest ways imaginable. I can't let my kids, I can let my kids hear me apologize, and I can let them hear me take responsibility. I can tell them and show them that you can stand your ground and still examine how you have treated someone while standing firm. And maybe that's one of the ways my dad's life continues to shape mine. Not through guilt, through what I chose to do differently because I loved him. I can't spend the rest of my life standing in that doorway, waiting for an opportunity that isn't coming. But I can decide what I do with everything that he left me, the memories, the lessons, the love, and even the regret. Because maybe moving forward doesn't mean leaving any of those things behind. Maybe it means learning which parts are meant to be carried and which ones were finally allowed to be put down. So, this is where I land today. I think one of the greatest illusions we live with is the belief that there will always be more time. Another phone call, visit, birthday, another chance to say, I'm sorry, or that I love you, another chance to make something right until there isn't. And I don't say that to make anyone afraid of losing the people that they love. I say that because maybe remembering that our time together is finite can change the way we use the time that we actually have left. Maybe we apologize a little sooner. Maybe we listen a little longer. Maybe we stop needing to win every argument and we say the thing that we've been putting off because we assume we there will always be a better time to say it. There may never be a perfect time. There is only the time that we're given. And while we can't control how much of it we get, we can decide what we do with it. Here's a couple of questions for you this week to ponder. Is there something you need to say to someone while you still have the chance to say it? And is there something you've been waiting to make right because you assumed you'd have more time? And one last thing, Dad, 10 years later, I still miss you. And I hope I never forget the sound of your voice. I hope I always remember the little things because somehow those are the things that don't feel so little anymore. I love you, Dad. If this resonated with you, please head over to our community section and let us know your thoughts. I'd love to continue the conversation with you there. And until next time, keep thinking good thoughts, keep asking good questions, and I'll see you next week.